Welcome to the Jeremy Gorham Leadership Podcast, a conversation designed to encourage and equip ministry leaders. And now, here's your host, Jeremy Gorham.
Well, hey there, welcome to the Leadership Podcast. With me today are two guys that I've known for quite a while, about 6 to 8 years, and have been very influential in my life, and hopefully you'll be able to glean a lot of valuable insight onto the topic that I want to talk to you about today is preaching, how to plan, prepare, and preach powerful sermons. And so with me are John Scherholtz and Dave Bretsch. John, go ahead and tell them a little bit about yourself. He's a very interesting man.
I was raised outside New York City. Now I live in Buffalo. I was pastor there for 25 years. I was the youth pastor, associate pastor, and senior pastor. I senior pastored from 2001 up until last year. And I've taken a position with the district, and I'm a strategic church growth planner, helper, strategizer. So that's kind of what I'm doing now.
Operator.
I've got 5 kids. So that's me.
Quite busy. And John, you took over Kenmore Alliance when they were roughly around what attendance?
About 200.
And when you left?
About 700.
So he knows a little bit about how to grow a church, and he's been very helpful in our district with other pastors, coaching them. So Dave, tell a little bit about yourself.
So I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and spent the majority of my life there. Did youth ministry for about 8 years, and got into the Alliance, got ordained in the Western Pennsylvania district of the Alliance, and then ended up here in 2012. So I've been here a little bit over 6 years, lead pastor.
2012, really?
Yeah.
So we came into the district right around the same time as young pups, learning from these older gentlemen.
Yep.
And one of the things that first just came to me when you said youth ministry is the value that youth ministry has, and you did youth ministry too, in preparing a young pastor for preaching. Can you guys talk a little bit about the value that, some youth pastors listening to this, wanting to preach on the big stage, chomping at the bit to talk to adults, what would you say to them about the value of the platform they have right now in the season of their life?
Yeah, there's no better training ground than youth ministry, because when you're in youth ministry, you have to figure out how to engage people. You have to be practical, you have to be relevant, and if you're not engaging them, they're going to elbow each other, and they're going to throw things, and they're going to look around, and they're going to get distracted, and so you have to work very hard to engage them and to be succinct, one point, make sure that when their parents pick them up and say, "What'd you learn?" they have something to say. So it was a great training ground for me.
The students are probably the most unforgiving crowd that you could ever preach in front of, at least what I found. If you can preach to a group of students and keep their attention, you'll know it. And you'll know if you're not connecting with them really quick.
Oh, they don't give you much feedback. I mean, in 8 years of youth ministry, I probably got less than 5 encouraging comments after one of my sermons. So you just
Maybe you just stunk.
Maybe I'm just
I got lots.
There you go. I always think that's probably one of the greatest platforms, and people shouldn't take for granted that season that they have in front of a youth group to prepare to preach sermons that connect. And so what was your experience?
Same. I mean, I just think I got through a lot of bad lessons, and I think that's just what they say in welding. You need bench time. You need time on the bench practicing welding before you can actually weld well. And I think youth pastoring is a great opportunity just to teach and get bench time and preparing, writing, researching. And also I think the idea of making it something that connects with them. You have to work really hard taking those eternal truths and connecting it to their lives.
Yep.
And I think that helps a lot. If you can do that with youth, then it makes it easier with adults.
One of the men in my life that I really respect is my father-in-law. He's been pastor for a long, long time, and he's always told me that if you could preach to a middle schooler, if you could preach to that 5th grader in the audience in big church, then you can connect with most people. And youth pastors seem to always have that natural ability to always keep in mind a younger generation within the congregation. They have some faults, obviously, that they need to work on, but that's one thing that often comes natural, that you're preaching to that level so that they can start engaging in. So I think your guy, Adam Williams from Kenmore, probably does that very naturally. The other thing that he probably naturally does is he's very, like you said, short, succinct, to the point, shorter sermons, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that because the attention span thing. But I think also, you start shooting over kids' heads, you're actually shooting over a lot of adults' heads. I think we assume because, we understand something in the Bible that most of the adults do too. And I think as a youth pastor, you're kind of working with the assumption that these kids need the backdrop of this. They don't need big Greek words. They don't need all that stuff. And if you're going to use those big words, it's fine. You got to explain them. And I think sometimes in big church we forget that, and it goes over a lot of people's heads.
And I know when I was doing youth ministry, I did a lot of object lessons to try to get them to know it and, for it to be memorable. But adults need object lessons too. And so that's kind of helped me. I do a lot of visuals, because if you want to reach everybody, you got to reach people who are very visual learners.
Yep.
And so that helped me.
More and more, our generation, our culture is going that way. All right, so enough about youth ministry. How do you guys plan out a sermon calendar? What are some things to keep in mind if you were going to say something to someone who's listening to this, and where do I even start? Because it's overwhelming if you're in a week, you're not in this anymore, although you preach a lot in other churches. He's just using the same message over and over again, so that's easy. But how do you come at it? Sundays come and Sundays come and Sundays come and week after week after week, and it seems like 1 week off, a guest speaker comes in or another pastor comes in and preaches. It's just not enough to really get a grip on what's next. So how do you go about keeping your head above water, really seeking God and really hearing from Him clearly, like a series, a book of the Bible? What are some of the things that have worked well for you to actually know what to preach in a given year? Let's go first.
Well, when I started, I preach. Every year or every 18 months, we preach the vision. So we go through a 7 or 8 week series and we preach right through our vision. And so that always gives me something in the year to always have. And we do that in different passages, different ways.
Do you have a specific month that you do that or time of the year that
I usually do either January or September, because those are kind of kickoff months. Their calendar, that I try to do that. Usually that's the two we kind of gear our small groups around that. We do that, so I kind of know what's going to come in that area those times. But really, to be honest with you, what our church has done, what I've done is almost easy, is because of that, the overwhelming nature of all these topics, all these things. We just go through books of the Bible. So we have a young pastor, when I first started, came up to me and said, just preach books of the Bible.
Okay.
At that time, nobody was doing that. They kind of stopped doing that back in the early 90s. And I just started preaching through books of the Bible, and that helps me with that.
Not skipping any verses or any
Oh,
passages?
no, I skip.
Okay,
I skip. I can't preach everything, because it would be like, half a verse.
I've heard some pastors say that, and then 5 years later, they're still in the book of Luke.
Well, I've done 2.5 years in Luke.
Okay.
So I try to move it in different speeds. So, for example, that's a great example, Luke. I took 2.5 years to go through the book of Luke, and then I said, we're going to do an Old Testament book next. We're going to do Daniel. I'm going to do it in 12 weeks.
Okay.
So one chapter. So I'll speed up or slow down depending. I did a 41-week series in the first book of the Psalms, one Psalm a week. So you can make it as fast or as slow as you want to go. Did Isaiah, the second half of Isaiah, we did one chapter. So I think you can vary the speed depending on what your congregation needs. You go through the book Gospel of Luke, there's so much there. So I think for me, it's always great. I know what the next passage. So either it's the problem of choosing a passage or choosing a topic, or for me it is I have the passage, now getting that truth out of that's going to connect with my people.
Sure.
So there's struggle in writing a sermon no matter way, but I've chosen to take the struggle out of not what I'm going to preach, just what the exact content or what part of that passage is.
That does take off a lot of stress. I know, especially early on in our ministry, we were much different. We were going series, which lends itself to a lot of topics, also lends itself to a lot of on-ramps. But in that, we're having to figure out what are we preaching about? What are we preaching about in 6 weeks? What are we preaching about in 12 weeks? Not having it set for 2.5 years. So there's two ways to approach it. Series, maybe 4 to 6 week series. Books of the Bible, which might lend itself to longer periods of time.
Or you can break a book, like I remember when we did Acts, we broke it into 3 different series with themes, with images. So we said, okay, for this section of Acts, we're going to preach this thing, this. And so we had 3 or 4, I think it was 4 different sub-series that kind of made it feel like better for on-ramps.
I've seen that happen, because that was the question I was going to ask you. If you have whatever 2.5 years is, how many weeks? That's a lot of weeks. At what point is there not any on-ramps for new people or current people that are in your church to feel that urgency? We're starting something new. Let me go out and reach out to my neighbor to bring him in to hear this. How are you dealing with that to get people in if someone chooses that method?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with how you approach the passage and how you're doing it. If you're constantly just building on former, like I'm in the middle of a story, then that would be bad. Like if I'm constantly, every time I walk in the message, I'm like, oh, I don't know what's going on but I really believe the Bible is broken up in such a way that a new section is almost like a new sermon. So I'm preaching the book of Luke, and all of a sudden we talk to, 1 week we're talking to a Pharisee, next week we're talking to a sinful woman, or what. It kind of lends itself to topics. And when I did the Psalms, every Psalm had like a different topic.
Sure.
So I think sometimes you get thinking that people won't jump on, but I've never had anybody come to me and say, well, I don't feel like coming to your church because you're in the middle of a book right
Yeah.
now. I think more of it's in a study, or when you're building on something. There's more like that. I preached the book of Romans, and that took us quite a bit. And people kept coming. New people kept coming.
And I think I've heard young leaders use that excuse a lot, but there's proof in the pudding. Something had to have worked between 250 and 700 or 750. People hear a good sermon, they enjoy it, they're wrestling with it. They're going to want to then engage the community and invite people to church.
And I
I mean,
think-
it could be as simple as that, right?
Or also as simple as make sure your sermon you're preaching to your 5th grader, your 7th grader, your 8th grader, so that when you're preaching these, you're thinking about, with a youth pastor mind, go back to the original thing, you're thinking about how do I engage people, and no matter what text I'm in. But I heard, we've all heard stories about churches that grew teaching Leviticus. I mean, I think a lot of it's not what part of the Bible it is or what series, it's how you take that individual thing and how you
Sure.
engage.
Because you could also say, we're doing a series, invite your friends, and the past series stunk. There's no urgency for me to invite the friend to that. If preaching's good,
Right.
no matter how you slice it or dice it. The other thing I would say with how you do it is we have the ability now to leverage technology. So if you're in the middle of a series and you're just not understanding the whole context of what's happening, it's very easy to get caught up just by binge watching a couple sermons. And people will do that if it's good.
Binge
They'll get
watching
caught up.
sermons.
Netflix, right?
Every time I work-
Binge. Yeah.
That's good.
That's what they do with it. All right, so how to talk about your approach this year? You're doing something new
Yeah.
in your church to go through the entire Bible. So this is a different approach to how you've done sermon
Yeah,
series, and
'cause-
what are the benefits of it?
Because we did topical in the past, like every Sunday after Labor Day is small group Sunday. No matter what we're doing, that's always, we're pumping up small groups, and then we have a big small group sign up, because that's a big value for our church. And then obviously Christmas, you build in things that are catchy, and then the 4 or 5 Sundays after Easter, we try to do something that's catchy, marriage, home, something that is going to draw people, because we know those are the high times of the year.
Something that addresses a felt need that they might be struggling with.
Right.
Okay.
Right. But we started something new January 1st of this past year called Mission 119, started by John Soper. And it's 91 weeks of reading through the entire Bible. And each week has 5 daily readings. And so I'll take a passage from the upcoming week that they're going to read that week, and I'll pick one of those passages and I'll preach on it. And it's been, in some ways, it's less work because you don't have to go find passages
Right.
like the previous method.
Like John was saying,
Yeah,
it's already set for you.
right. But at the same time, sometimes you're going to run into passages like we're doing Numbers, and we're like, how am I going to find a sermon in Numbers here or
It
something?
was a
like
miracle.
that.
He did a great job. That was I heard his sermon in Numbers. Go podcast that one. It was you did a great job on that. And your people know that, hey, Numbers could be interesting, and you did a wonderful job.
Yeah, so
Good
it's
job.
been good. And we're getting people reading the Bible. They're slugging through Numbers, and as a church, we're all doing this together, and they're listening to John Soper because he gives 10 to 12 sermons every day on each reading. So,
How long are those?
10 to 12 minutes is each.
So like a little commentary on the passage.
Yes, yeah. So, and he's good. He's good, so it's been good. It's been a challenge for me. It's something that because I lean more towards the topical stuff, but this has been good.
So
And
you
I'm
feel
able
like-
to find even topics within, like Joshua, I did a series called I Deserve It, which is all about like selfishness. And it was very memorable. People come up to me at Little League games and say, talk about, hey, I deserve it, and
You said a
With-
series.
within the book of Joshua, I was able to, a theme jumped out. So I called the series I Deserve It, and it was going through the book of Joshua.
This year when you're in Mission 119.
Yes.
So you have, like you were saying, themes.
Yes.
Series, mini-series within
Yeah.
the whole big series.
Under
Yes.
Authority was
Okay.
the one year now.
All right.
That's a really good one. Under Authority was
Yep.
it.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah,
I looked
Andy
on
did
your
that.
website.
Yep.
Okay.
So we can still make it topical, felt need, practical, and still walk through the Bible. But then sometimes it does get a little tricky. Like we'll do Like Numbers, I didn't make that topical. That was just the title of the sermon series was Numbers, and we did 3 sermons on Numbers that had nothing to do with.
So are you calling them series?
Yes.
Okay, series within the bigger series.
Yes.
I think that's interesting because I think that's what a lot of the pushback of longer series, year-long things through the Bible or.
Oh, I would
through a
never
book.
do a 2.5-year series. That would be.
Yeah, no, Jesus really isn't worth 2.5 years. I agree.
This is good.
Yeah. We need peacemakers. We're Scott.
So I'm in the middle. Yeah. Right. Yeah, because that's the pushback that I often hear about longer series. There's no on-ramp. So you're trying to leverage series within a series.
Yeah.
We did the same thing. We're doing a series called Cover to Cover. And I saw that you had the whole year reading plan laid out for people from day one. They could grab it and just read ahead if they wanted to.
92 weeks.
So
the
they
whole
could
92
really
weeks
get
is
ahead.
laid out, yeah.
So we were struggling with even that idea. Like, do we give them all the readings up front? If I do a whole year-long thing, does it get redundant? What do we call it? We really were valuing on-ramps every single month, and so our creative person actually designed monthly themes around the passages that we were going to talk about. And so the graphic gets changed out every month. There's a new look to it. There's an invite to it. There's an emphasis behind those four messages. That seems like we're still in the middle of it, but that seems to keep it a little bit fresh.
Yeah.
So that we don't get into that rut. But
If I said we're doing a 92-week sermon series on going through the Bible, that's painful for me. I gotta break it up into something that's 4 to 6 weeks or even 2 weeks. Make it practical, images, videos that go along with it. I mean, a lot of our people probably don't even know we're going through the Bible in 92 weeks because we break it up into series.
bite size. He's compromising though. He's at least getting
No, it's
closer.
I mean, it's more credit to you guys doing the whole Bible. I'm just did books. So I mean, you guys
You're
are doing
a loser.
Yeah, you're
You're
listening
doing
to
the
Genesis, man. That's impressive. I didn't make that kind of commitment. I just made a commitment to a
You're
book of
just
the Bible.
half
So,
committed.
yeah.
Okay, so we talked about planning series. How do you go about planning sermons? The nuts and bolts, nitty gritty weekly routine. What was you're kind of out of the weekly routine now, but what did you do when you were in the weekly grind of knowing 6 days from now I got to preach another sermon? Where would you start? Where would you go to for some research? How would you kind of structure the thing?
It's a big question.
It's a lot of questions.
Yeah,
Bring it in.
I would. Okay, so I have a passage before me that I'm preaching on. Obviously, I read the passage, and I would read and read and read. Actually, this needs to be said. I also have everybody in my life praying for the message. Like I was around pastors for years that never asked for prayer for their sermon.
You know, one of the things I value about Adam when he preaches, Adam Williams at your church from Kenmore, when he preaches, he's always on Facebook asking for prayer.
Right.
He always asks for prayer. I always see it every Saturday night. I know when Adam's going to preach.
It feels selfish to ask for prayer for my sermon. That's why some of us
way.
don't pray.
It's
It feels like
No, I think whenever I'm with guys and all week long in church, I've been prayer meeting or in meeting with men or praying. Like, what can we pray for you about? It's sermon. And I had guys that were just regularly praying for me because, again, I have a passage and sometimes I'll read it and be honest with you and go, I have no idea what this is saying. I don't understand it. I just pray and pray. And to me, that was the miracle of preaching. Is as I begin to look at the passage, all of a sudden, this thought comes through, this profound. And so I'm looking for that idea. I'm looking for how it impacts me. What truth is there that I feel like applies to our lives? What eternal truth in the Scripture is in that passage? So if I'm reading a story, and I read the story and say, okay, what is this story? What truth about God or about people or about life is here? And so I think I have the passage, I read it, I have people praying for me. And then when the best way to come up with a sermon, right, is that this idea surfaces. And when that idea surfaces, I begin to then create a sermon around that main idea, that main thought.
Okay.
And say, okay, so as I read, I did a sermon recently, a new sermon, out of Chronicles, and I read, and I kept seeing in this passage was this idea of role models, and about which king followed which king and his father or whatever, and so this idea of choosing right role models just started coming out. These guys are all talking about role models. Who's your role model? So that kind of just came to the surface. So I read a passage until some kind of truth that comes
So
through.
you read it until it happens. Typically, how often do you just stay on that passage of Scripture until something surfaces?
yeah, it's different every week.
Okay.
The main idea, the big idea should come, I would hope, early, and then the development after that. So I would want to get, I think if we write it the other way, I've been coaching people who write it, I read and study the passage, and through that course of the week, I come up with my big idea. Then you have all this material that might not necessarily relate to
Right.
that. But if I can formulate the big idea first, then I can save time by
like that.
just building things around it. So for example, I find all this history about Hezekiah and his thing, and well, that doesn't really go with being a right role model. I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to go to some. Well, what about the Assyrians? And that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about choosing right role models. So again, it helps me even kind of curtail my research. I'm a very relational person. I don't want to sit in my office. And I got a lot of things to do as a senior pastor.
Sure.
I would just sit in my office and research the whole time. And so that main idea helps me to kind of develop the things that I really need to.
Yeah.
Whereas if I go the other way, I have all this material that I love and is enjoyable and interesting, and then sometimes I just keep adding until
Sure.
I get like 3 sermons out of one.
I hope you heard what he does. I think that's super, super valuable information, especially for young preachers. We had a couple guys on our staff that just started out preaching, and they were like, "What do I do? How do I start?" One of the main things I told them to do was, because you've got about a month they had before they preached, don't just start digging into all this research and get so just bogged down by it. You start brain dumping all over a sheet of paper that you might not use. I just said, it's because you got so much time, read it once, let it sit for a couple days. Let it marinate, let it, stir in the crock pot, read it again. I just said, keep reading the passage until something, that's the most simple
And
way to find
I would
it.
even avoid, unless I don't understand something, I would even avoid, I would avoid commentaries. Now, maybe that was when I was more advanced, but just initially, like you said, I gotta be honest with you, I have 4 sermons on a Sunday, on a weekend, and I'd be opening up the Bible during the worship set, reading the next passage, starting to get ready, okay, what's next week gonna be? I start reading it that early on, because I say, I wanna make sure, what's the next idea coming?
That's good. So Monday morning, well, actually you're off on Mondays. Tuesday morning comes, Tuesday afternoon, whenever you start it, what are you doing?
So I typically have my big idea maybe 4 weeks in advance, because I'll have, typically I'll have all 4 of my sermons prepared before I give the first one. So typically I'm 4 weeks out.
When you say prepared, how much of the sermon is done? The outline?
I
full
know what the big
manuscript?
idea is. I've done most of the research on it. I know where I'm going, so
Okay.
that when I start in week 1, I don't say things
Sure.
I can save to week 4. So I know what the big ideas are the weeks ahead of time. So, but what I do is I'll take my Bible program. I'll copy the passage. I'll paste it on the paper, and then I'll just read all my commentaries and just write it all out and try to come up with my practical illustrations. I'll listen to other preachers on it. I'll call people. I'll ask people in the office. I'm like, hey, what do you think about this? I give my sermon to the staff. At least 3-4 people hear my sermon every week before I actually give it. And they're giving me feedback. So I'm always thinking about the sermon before I give it.
That's really, really good. That's not procrastination. That's being prepared.
I think, can I just say something? I think what you do is, I do it too. I would have my sermon, I'd go, okay, let me run it by you. And I have a staff person go, I'll run it by you. What do you think? And sometimes they would be like, I don't understand what you're talking about. And so I'd have to rework this. Or I always include others. Now, we come from churches with, I understand some of you guys are on multiple staff, but I would always, bringing them into the creative process also helps them learn how this is done.
Sometimes it's better that it not be a staff person.
Right.
Sometimes it's better to get a lay person in there, but that's critical, because for me, writing sermons every single week, especially 4 weeks out, I'll get to that in my head. I know we're going there, but in the meantime, this sermon doesn't make any sense. In my mind it does, but to them it doesn't. And in my mind, I'm thinking I'm hitting on what they're really struggling with, but it's really not. And so that's very valuable. When I've been able to preach it to people ahead of time, they're giving me things that I would never have seen. They're also critiquing it in ways that I would never really want to even go there. Like I think it's good, but they're, after listening and pondering at what they're saying, I think they're right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think it's, and this is a bold, I think it's crazy to get up in the pulpit and give a sermon without anybody else hearing it. I think that's crazy, because then it's just you and God, I think you got to have other people. We're the body of Christ.
Yeah.
We should do this together. We should get other people giving us feedback. Some of my best illustrations are from people that I gave my sermon to, and they say, "Oh yeah, let me tell you about how this affected my life." And then I share it Sunday morning, and it's changing people's lives. So
Testimonies.
yeah,
Yeah, what I like about how you preach is you really are very well connected with how people think, what people are going through, what they're struggling with. A, because you're relational. B, because you're giving the sermon ahead of time, so you're probably hearing stuff like you just said. Well, that's really connected with me. When you're preaching it to other people and they're giving you feedback, one of the things that I think we should get feedback on is how did that hit home with you? And that's probably what you should really be emphasizing, because other people are going to lean into their story as well, because it connects with them. The other thing I've seen you do, and this is a good practice, Adam asked for prayer on Facebook. You ask for a lot of feedback on Facebook. You'll get, a couple examples that you can maybe give for us, but you're constantly asking questions, and you look at the comments. People in your church are just replying left and right. You actually, before you even go into the study for your sermon, you already have valuable illustrations that people have given you. Can you give an example?
yeah, just something simple as tell me how Jesus has changed your life, and you'll get all these comments practically. How he changed my finances, he changed my marriage, he changed the way that I relate to people at work, and so I can use them. Sometimes I'll call them up. I'll say, can we videotape you on this, or can you expand on that? And I'll put their quote up on the screen. Or hey, what do you guys think? Should people give to their local church? Should people support their local church financially? And you'll get lots of different answers, and that helps me. Okay, this is how people are processing this, and it's just.
So you might not use their quote, but it does influence how
Right.
you approach your sermon.
Yeah.
And what people are going through.
I think it's a great insight. Is just there's the truth of Scripture. I got to spend time doing that. I hate the phrase, so I'm not going to use it. It's like exegeting your culture. I don't like that, but knowing where the connection point is. Where does this eternal truth of God connect with people? And sometimes we just have this stuff that's out there floating, and we forget it's really important to find out where those two things come together. I think in what you're doing, your processing is, okay, how does that? And what I try to do is just try to come up with that, that question that is being answered. Am I answering a question anybody cares about?
Yes.
And so if there isn't that, and that gets into the writing, if I'm not, my big idea doesn't actually concern anybody, either I have to convince people it's an important question, I have to spend time doing that, but it's got to connect somewhere in their lives. Because if they're walking in with this, then I've got to somehow give it to them and then explain how this connects, or I have to grab something that they're already asking the question about.
Yeah, I think too many pastors probably are answering questions no one's asking or no one cares about.
Yeah, I think so.
And certainly the gospel is above culture, it's above our situation, but it should also be influential in every single aspect of our life. So if it doesn't hit it.
I think John at your campus did a great job in his opening illustration of coming up with a question of how to live in this society. And he had a great illustration about something was going on in his local library that was really offensive. How do we deal with it? I think that's somewhere everybody lives.
Yeah, so what happened,
Great, yeah.
The illustration that John's referring to, our John Schenk, our campus pastor in Wellsville, he started off his passage on Daniel, his sermon on Daniel, by talking about how do we live with integrity in a very evil world. And nearby library, what they did was brought in a transgender speaker, author. The title of the books were just, really far out there, outrageous. And they were actually bringing in people at the public library. Children. And he really leveraged that because it created that tension. He's like, what would you do? My wife and I talked about it. What would we do? What would our response be? And the rest of his sermon flowed as a result of that. People just leaned in, and because it connected with them on a very, very personal level. So I really liked that, really appreciated that. So what else? How do you, part of preparing is not just wrestling with the passage, it's also wrestling with the culture, but how to connect the two. One of the ways that we do that as preachers is illustrations. You mentioned the big idea. How do you come up with, let's talk about illustrations first. Where do you get your illustrations from? How do you program yourself to always be looking for them? What have you found helpful so that you can get a little bit, make the message come alive,
I think there's levels of illustrations, if I was going to say. There's the best, and then there's the lowest. I think you can use everything in between. But I would
The best and the worst?
is the highest grade. Like I would say grade of meat. Like the A cut, the best illustrations are personal, self-deprecating, spiritual ones that directly apply to that. So it's a personal, this happened to me in my life, It isn't glorifying self. It isn't, hey, this is what I
Sure,
did.
sure.
And that to me is the best. If you have those examples, they're very embarrassing, they're difficult, but they really grab people and it opens that up.
So give your example this past week you preached.
Yeah, so you say the best kind of humor is stuff that comes right from the passage. So one of the passages says, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. And so I just paused and I said, I just made fun of my feet and said, my feet are ugly.
Can we get a picture of your feet for the podcast so we can show everybody?
Absolutely not. And I talked about how my feet are ugly and I don't want anybody to see my feet, and I hope nobody ever sees them. And then at the end of Vacation Bible School, some lady came up to me and said, so Dave, when are you going to get a pedicure? And I just ran into her at the restaurant just a couple hours ago. Instant connection. We're laughing. They're talking about my feet. We're just laughing. It was a fantastic, dumb illustration that really didn't even have much spiritual value, but it got people laughing, self-deprecating, lowered their defenses, and it was a quick illustration, moved on, got people engaged.
Connected with it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the passage is talk about beautiful feet. So how can you make your feet beautiful? Bring good news, right? So I think to me, that's the highest level. And then, because obviously I have a big family, the kids are a great resource, but you have to get their permission. And the way I did it when they were younger is I pay them $1 for every time I use them in illustration.
I don't get my 3-year-old's permission.
So I get permission.
It's
I get
the age
permission.
level, right?
I get permission, yeah, exactly. So I get permission, and with my wife, I always ask permission. And so family stuff is great. That connects with people. Your personal life gets great. The next level would be people you know, and I just do it by not mentioning names unless they give me the freedom to do that. Sure. So I use people that I know. This person I know did this or this happened. That's the second tier. Third tier would be, some story you read or something you read in a book. And then there's the last tier, which I think is still okay to use. Sometimes you just make up a story, make up a parable, if you don't have an illustration, make one up. You can write. Jesus made parables. We can write stuff.
So you were saying off camera earlier, which I thought was a great example of, what was it, Revelation 1 and the soccer team and the church, right?
Right.
So give that
Well, I
example.
just
really good.
We're talking about, I'm preaching on Revelation chapter 1. I did last week, and the question was, I thought the big idea here was John is telling the church why they should keep going. He's been exiled. He's had his life in a secular way destroyed. And why do you keep going on? Why church? And so I started with an open illustration about a soccer team. Why do kids play soccer?
And you put the picture
The
up.
picture of the soccer team up. Why do you play soccer? And why would your kid play soccer? If they asked why play soccer, what could the answers be? And there's a whole lot of answers you could play soccer for. And I'll let the church answer that, and then we transition to why church. Why do church? And transition from why church to the answer, and then why the answer. And then, so I just
your
got
whole sermon was built on 6 points that pointed
To
to
the why.
the reason,
Right.
which is
by Jesus, right? So, but why is Jesus worth going through all these difficulties? Why is he worth giving time and energy to the church? So you just you take the obvious easy one, the soccer team. My kids all played. Well, 3 of my kids have played on some kind of organized soccer, all the way down to, hey, here's the church and why that is.
Yeah.
And then you come back around and say, people ask you tomorrow, why do you do church?
So just you come up with those things. They're just natural.
I think
You're just looking for them. Like how
I was wondering about, because you asked me about that. I think a big part is reading. Like, I've heard guys say that. I've heard preachers say that you have to read. I know guys who don't read a lot. I'm not talking about scholarly books, but just read. Like, I read a lot of history. My church would joke about how many historical examples. So I'm constantly absorbing from culture, from film, from whatever I'm experiencing, because a lot of people are experiencing it too. And then so I use a lot of historical stories to kind of pull in, open up an illustration.
Yep.
I think reading is and if you're not a big reader, then observing and watching, and you gotta be careful with referring people to an R-rated movie or something. I'm always kind of nervous about that, so I would be careful about what I'm referring people to. But I think that's one of their sources. But I think again, always on the lookout for something. Always on the lookout. Maybe I'm not gonna use it this week, but maybe I'll use it somewhere else.
So one of the things that works into a routine or a rhythm in preaching I found helpful is that if I'm starting, you have Monday off, I have Friday off, but if I'm starting on my sermon Monday and can get 80 to 90% of it done and let it brew, let it sit, something in the news, something in culture. I forgot what the sermon was about, so maybe it wasn't that great, but remember what color is the dress?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, purple or gold.
Purple or gold.
Blue or gold.
And it just so happened, I mean, I don't know when that came out on Facebook. Maybe I saw it on like a Wednesday. But my message was already written. And then it was just like gold, it was just hand delivered.
Or blue.
Oh, okay, yeah. And I mean, everybody just like, just started shouting out answers, and everybody was engaged, and it led right into the passage that I was talking about, which I can't remember, so it might have not been that great, but it was just because I had my antenna up, my radar up.
I think when you
and the heavy
Right.
lifting was done 4 weeks ago in your case, or, on
But
Monday.
the big idea gives you, right? Because if I get the big idea early,
That's the radar.
and then I'm like, okay, my ears are open, and all of a sudden someone tells me a story, a personal story, or something like this, or something like that.
Yeah.
Like, man, that works right into this. And I agree with you. The news is, I've had lots of times where I've gone, I'm scrapping my open illustration. I just got a better one yesterday. I just got a better
Yeah.
one today. Because again, that to me is always changeable, right? Big ideas is never like, this is the idea. Now, if I get something here I can put on there, or I'll be reading in my devotions. Oh man, this New Testament passage is almost parallel. The other one I will use for illustrations, I like using the Bible to illustrate the Bible. So if I'm preaching out of the Old Testament, I almost always want to use a New Testament illustration. It's kind of almost like a religious thing for me. I want to have Jesus in almost every sermon. So I want to find maybe a story about Jesus or some teaching in the New Testament if I'm doing, and vice versa. If I'm in the New Testament, I like going back and referring to the Old Testament. Because there's always, usually God's Word has a parallel. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, a lot of that's just in Proverbs. A lot of it is.
We're finding that in the cover to cover series because you're stuck in the Old Testament for so long. You got to bring in the New Testament because the Old Testament's pointing to Jesus, the coming of Jesus.
Right.
I'm assuming that's the case for you because of your Old Testament, New Testament reading plan.
You did a great job in Numbers, going to Hebrews, right? That was a parallel passage. You just jump right into the temple, understanding the new temple, and so I think, yeah, you got to do that.
So for you, Dave, illustrations, I know you listen to a lot of other preachers. You mentioned that earlier. Not that, we can tip the hat, as our DS often says, but we can also, for me, I found it helpful to get like ideas, to spark ideas, to get the idea of brain going. How have you kind of leveraged other people's sermons without flat out, I'm plagiarizing. I'm just going to, I'm going to make up, this didn't happen to me, but I'm going to pretend like it happened to me.
Yeah.
Never do
Outside
that.
of that, right. But how have you leveraged other people's sermons to kind of spark ideas?
So what I do now is after my sermon's pretty much done, I'll go to YouTube and just, put my topic in and listen to even some guy I don't even think is that great of a preacher. If he's on that passage, I might listen to him as I'm working out on the treadmill or whatever. There's a few preachers that I'll go to. I'll be like, oh yeah, I remember he preached on this. Let me listen to that. Because he may have an illustration or he may have a little different statement or a way of approaching it that helps me. I don't go to that beforehand because then I'm tempted to copy his whole sermon, but I'll go to it after, and it always helps. I remember doing a sermon on prophecy, which was an incredibly difficult sermon to give because I'm just trying to figure out what prophecy is. And I was washing dishes the day before, and I was listening to Piper, just like a 7-minute clip on what prophecy was, and I was like, that's the missing piece that I needed. And I kind of pulled in that piece and kind of brought the whole sermon together. So oftentimes stuff comes to me last minute that just pull it all together. That's the illustration. That's the statement I needed.
See, I think that's in large part so underutilized because it's like what you said with books. I read that the average author spends 2 years of their life writing a book. So if you were to write a book, you're going to pull from at least 2 years' experience, and it's going to take you a couple of years to pull all that together. So when you read a book, you're fast tracking that knowledge. You're really gleaning from someone who's really studied this. Same thing with a sermon. If you can leverage some of those thoughts that people have, sifted through all the clutter, gotten to a big idea, you tip the hat, but they've put in, however many hours they could prepare a sermon, 20, 25 hours, 30 hours, and you can listen to it nowadays in a matter of minutes. Right? 7-minute drive.
Well, I'll do Sermon Central. I'll put the passage in. And I've never copied an outline, sometimes I just do it just to saturate.
It triggers ideas.
It triggers ideas. It saturates this. Sometimes I say, well, I'm definitely not going to go that way. Or, I kind of pull that in. Yep. But I think also, like, if you're connecting with people, like through small groups, through relationships, that's where, like, again, you have this big idea. I've been in a lot of conversation with a guy, like you said, and you go, man, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Can I use that? Or, man, that really illustrates that. And I think if you engage with people, So do we spend time in the office preparing? Yeah, we have to do some of that. But I think as you let a passage speak to you, I think then the people in your life, and
Sure.
I tell you, I don't do a lot of commentary work because again, the truth that I want to get out is not going to be this deep buried thing that nobody's ever seen before. I want to take the surface truth.
Where it intersects with their life.
And where is it right here? I don't want to have to try to explain to you how I got this thing because you don't understand the depths of the, this and that. The back work is important, or texture work is important, but it's only if it's a controversial subject that it's not plain as day what Jesus is trying to say.
Sure.
Or Paul, or Numbers, or whatever.
Whether it's with Facebook like you do, getting replies and then being able to use a quote in the sermon, or whether it's a video testimony, I think that's so crucial. If you're not having conversations with people and saying, this is how this passage affected my life, are we really, really getting to the point of how that intersected with our congregation? Did it answer a question that they're asking? Did it help them in a situation that they've struggled with? We should be able to share, maybe in our own personal lives, because we have the sermon ahead of time, or if we're able to talk about it outside of the pulpit or the study, in real conversations, we can share some of those victories.
I think it's critical though, and this is when I go back to why the topics to me is not as good as preaching a passage. Because if that passage doesn't connect with me, see, this is preaching for me and teaching, and I know, again, all these semantics, but teaching to me is I'm giving you information that I have. Mm-hmm. Preaching to me is from in here. And unless that passage hits me here, and sometimes just topics don't hit me there. I'll be honest. So topic of stress, it's not something I own. But you give me a passage, and if it gets into here, and that's the part I can't tell you what time that happens in the week. And I'll tell my wife, to me it's like focusing a camera. I just keep twisting that thing until all of a sudden it's in focus.
Sure. That's a
But
good
it's
point.
when it comes here, because if it's not here, an AA friend of mine says, Alcoholics Anonymous, says, you preach from the heart to the heart. And so if it's not coming out of my heart, then it's not. And so when the passage hits me, then I'm guessing most times that I can translate it to other people.
Sure.
This is where this gripped me about my life, or about life in general, about the truth about who God is or something. Then when it's here, then I can figure out how this is. And this is maybe how it works for someone, a different gender or different. You gotta be mindful of women too, guys. We're all, speaking mostly to men, if you're women, and vice versa, like you gotta think about, sometimes we do too many sports illustrations, too many war illustrations or something. We gotta think about, hey, there's gotta be a balance here and that. But I think when it gets here, then it can,
Sure.
When you connect with a text to a point of on a visceral, personal level.
And be bold about trying to get feedback. Like I'm at my son's baseball game, sitting in the stands, and I'll just turn to someone and say, "Hey, I'm someone that I know, not some stranger." Though sometimes I have done that too, and I'll just say, "Hey, I'm doing this sermon this week. This is what I'm talking about. What do you think about this? Do you struggle with this?" And we'll talk, and they feel like they're a part of it. Oh wow, you value my opinion.
Amen. That's great.
I just can't. I have no patience for me and God, and now I'm giving it to the congregation with no feedback from other people.
I'm 100% with you.
It's poor. Utilize your church, utilize other resources that will help you produce.
Okay, so that's one of the ways that you guys come to the big idea is by getting that feedback, right?
Yeah.
How do you boil it down to the essential thing and get all the clutter out? How do you get to that big idea? What's the importance of a big idea?
So it's so
maybe it's not
critical.
that important.
I mean, no, it's critical.
Maybe you should go with 3 or 4 points.
No, you can have points as long as they're around the big idea.
All right.
So I would say that it should gravitate out of the text, and then I think it can be formulated by what you're doing. I agree 100%. I ask for feedback all the time. Was that good? Was it what can I do better? How can I think feedback and being secure in yourself that my value isn't in how good I preached today, and then giving other people credit for help form this. My job is to get this to people, to get this truth to people. Whatever I can do to make that a better process. But I think the big idea is just, I gotta say it comes out of the text. I gotta see it in there, that it's not a stretch. I
Okay,
gotta
so
force something. It's really, the text generates it, and then it gets formed, clarified through communication.
What
through
happens
trying
if there's a couple big ideas in the text?
I just choose one.
Did you just bite off too many verses
Yeah,
to chew?
you
tear
can't
it
preach
down?
everything. Yeah, I think you choose. I mean, I preached this sermon on Father's Day about role models. I mean, it was 4 chapters. And I put it in the scripture in the bulletin. First Chronicles, and the guy thought it was a typo. I said, no, I'm going to preach on 4 chapters, and I did, because I just took The big idea out of 4 chapters,
Okay.
and it was within 30 minutes. It wasn't like I preached an hour and a
Yeah,
half.
too long.
But again, the gist of it got through, and so I think the key is to pull that idea out, and you guys especially are challenged when you're preaching big chunks of scripture. Don't try to get everything in there.
It's hard.
Look at the bad thing is Jesus. He's teaching. Does he teach everything in every message? I just spoke to a young preacher the other day about it. You've got to be liberated from the idea of you've got to say everything in every message. You just can't. There's no way you can physically. So you sit there and go, well, there's this and there's this. I get it, but you can't do it all. People have got to walk out. And I love it. My wife was at church. I was preaching somewhere else. She was at our church. I said, what was the big idea? And she
That's
told me the
good.
big idea. The big idea was this. And it was Charles Jones this week at church, and it was perfect. It was great. Joshua, it was a great big idea. And so I think I can tell you your big idea, your numbers one, right? Come out of the camp, go outside the camp, bring people into the Holy of Holies. That was a great message about go out to the people that are outside the camp and bring them in. That's the message of the New Testament, right? I mean, that's how many weeks ago you preached that. I'm hearing stuff, but I can
job.
remember that.
Good
Wow,
job.
it was memorable.
So how do you avoid, this is a question for you, Dave, how do you avoid, because you said 4 weeks in advance you have the big idea, how do you avoid then going off on the tangent as you write? Like practically speaking, how do you avoid, as you're just typing away, I don't know how many pages you write, but let's say it's 3 pages, how do you avoid on page 2.5 or, the start of page 3, making sure that what you're typing and what you're trying to say doesn't get derailed from that main idea that you wanted to communicate?
I think that's a great question, and it's hard to do because it's
very
It's
difficult.
very easy, especially because I love history and I love taking a look at what this Greek word might mean and that kind of thing. And yeah,
Do you know Hebrew too?
I took it. I don't remember any of it. I just used the computer tools.
I know Hebrew 1.0.
Yahweh. Well, what I typically do is I actually do use a lot of commentaries. I do a lot of work with commentaries, and so I almost have like this big canvas of just stuff everywhere, and then I just shave it. Like I spend a lot of time it's like the editor for you got hours and hours of a movie and you're just chopping stuff. So I have a ton of information. I have all my commentaries, all my study Bibles, and then I just chop because I know what my big idea is. I'm like, that's great, but I got to chop that, and then I come to but sometimes I struggle because I'll be done with the message. I'm like, this is only a 20-minute message. I can't preach for 20 minutes because then people are leaving early and they feel like they didn't get anything out of church.
I wish some preachers would just preach for 20 minutes.
Yeah, but I want to go
Not
at
you,
least
though.
30,
Not
right?
you.
I want to go at least 30. So sometimes I'm like, okay, if I preach a sermon, it's going to be 15 minutes. I got to add something to it.
You really have that problem of having to add to sermon?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
So how do you avoid, you want to add to it, how do you avoid a second sermon then?
That's a great question because sometimes, like I did last week, I get 3 sermons, as I was gently told by.
I love it.
This message is only 10 minutes. I got to add 2 more sermons to this thing.
I think the key is I just think we can say we're overestimating people's ability to remember things. So we think if I speak for 45 minutes, I want my people to walk out with one thing and one thing hammered home. And it might not even be an action step. The other thing I think we need to liberate ourselves, if we give our people like 3 action steps every week. See, now that I'm not a pastor every week, I preach every week, and sometimes I just sit in the congregation. Sometimes I don't want 3 things to do this week or 4 things to do this week.
So let me tell you a story.
I just want a truth. I just want a truth. I want something. Hey,
it's
remind me who God is. Remind me that Jesus is worth it. Remind me about how beautiful and wonderful things are.
So here's what happens to me. I'll have it, and it's a 15-minute sermon. I'm like, this is a great sermon, but it's only 15 minutes. The way that I add to it is I'll find another passage that deals with the same topic. And I'll
Perfect.
bring that passage in.
That's
Or I'll
perfect.
try to come up with more illustrations so that I don't have 4 sermons. That does happen to me a lot. Most sermons, I have to work very hard to get them to 30 or 35 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's weird. I never heard of that before. A problem.
I've heard a lot of people having to like way too much information. They got to cut it down and cut it down and cut it down. But that's probably a good thing because you're so laser focused.
Yeah.
So 2 things. The story that I have. So we were at a previous, a different church. We were working at a different church, and they very good, presentation of the gospel. That was a high priority. Next steps. I don't know if you guys do next steps, but they valued next steps. They were really big in their church. They had a bulletin insert, all that stuff. The bottom of the bulletin insert, and on the back of each connection card that got printed every single week were next steps related to the sermon. So it was highly applicable. But there was always that tension in me where there was always like 4 or 5 next steps based off of the passage that was, and it was pretty like, okay, here they understood the big idea type of principle, but there was always like 4 or 5 next steps. So I that's kind of where I came from. So when I started preaching early on as a pastor, that's kind of what we would do. We'd have the bulletin insert 4 or 5 next steps. Obviously one of them, become a Christian, get baptized. But then there was always a few extras too. And then it would be on the back of the connection card. And I remember one of the elders, a wise man, who was listening to me preach for the first few months, and I would do, what's your next step today? Maybe it's this one, maybe it's this one, maybe it's and this one, and this one. What do you got to do today? And he told me one day after church, he's like, Jeremy, there's no way in the world anybody's doing all these next steps. Like, do you realize that next Sunday is 6 days away? Like, it's just not possible. And it really got me thinking about, like, all right, if I want someone to do one thing based off of this message, what could it be? What's realistic? How could we make progress in our relationship with Jesus and follow him? So that was pretty good advice. The other thing that I was thinking of to avoid getting off on a tangent on page 2 or page 3, or only having 15 minutes. Now I have to add 15 minutes and making sure that additional 15 minutes is related to the first 15 minutes. And I don't always do this, but it was in relationship to an author. A writer said the best way he keeps on message to write a book was he tapes on his desk an index card that is the title of his chapter, the thesis of his chapter, so that chapter stays on point. I always thought that's a pretty good practical tool to just put on your desk or to put up on the wall your big idea.
Right.
Your big idea, your one sentence, description of what you're trying to get, or your sticky statement.
I would say, I was going to add, if I ever got to a place where I don't think there's enough material here, I'm not saying it's never happened, but I think the other thing is, like, okay, so I like to structure my sermon, opening, hook, passage, and then we work through it, and usually it's points. I would just develop each point a little bit more, whether that's adding, like, if I need to expand it, I would just develop a point further that's still on the main topic. So, for example, a sub point was, Jesus is Savior. Well, I would look at maybe a Savior passage in the Old Testament, and then passage in the New Testament, and then and then a secular example of someone being saved. So I think the way to kind of make the message long without coming up with a second sermon is just saying, maybe within that text I could develop one of those, I can think of an old wagon wheel, one of the rungs coming into just make that one a little thicker. Just make that a little bit bigger, and then that would develop, because I think I've come into that place. What could I do to drive it home? But with the application, again, I'm a heavy application guy, and I really like sermons that apply, but sometimes application is just, I need to be encouraged this week.
Sure.
I need to be blessed this week.
I had a guy one time, when I first started at the church, he said to me, he was talking about a previous preacher, he said, when this one guy preached, I didn't know what to do. He said, when you preach a sermon, he looked at me, he said, tell me what to do. This guy was a lawyer, very, very smart guy. He said, I just want to know what to do. And I hear his voice in my head all the time. Every sermon I get done, I'm thinking, what do I want them to do? If there's no action step, I'm not finished. I gotta make sure they walk away knowing what to do.
Not always. I would say 75% of the time. Sometimes it's just knowing a truth that will change me. I don't know. Again, I've come around a little bit on this, just having to sit in church.
Maybe memorize this verse.
I'm an action guy. Don't get me wrong. I'm an application guy. I'm a big, but careful that, again, if you think about it, if our member in our church goes to church on Sunday, small group, listens to a podcast or two, how many action steps do they get? And then they don't do anything.
Sure.
So I appreciated Andy's sermon this week. Give him one thing. And he said, there's all these things, and we just do one.
Yep.
I like that. I like one thing. Or, what truth can change some things. I don't know. I'm still working through it.
Well, then maybe it's something as simple as, on a note card, here's the truth I want you to think about for 1 minute this week.
Right. Or exactly. Some step. I agree with you, though. I don't just want to hear stuff and not have any kind of, it's got to have some kind of practical application in my life. But exactly what that means, what that application looks like, might be different week to week. It might be a truth. It might be hey, I need to take a thing.
Does that lend itself more into I think you do sermon-based small groups, right?
Yes.
And we do that, we have done it, and now it's more of a church-wide thing we're trying to do through our series, cover to cover. But how much of that lends itself into what you were just saying, it carries over to Monday or Tuesday night when they meet?
Right.
We're talking about that, not a separate study.
Right.
More information, more information.
Right, I mean, think about it. The old days, you Sunday morning, you got a message, Sunday night, you had a message, and Wednesday, you had a message. How can you apply those three things?
It's, you know what's,
It's impossible.
church culture's changed, but our culture that we live in is added to that. We might not go to church on Sunday night or Wednesday night, but you listen to a podcast
Right.
Sunday night and Wednesday night.
Or
or
a
another
message on
sermon.
Sunday school.
It's information
Right,
overload.
Right, well, and if you had to throw Sunday school in there, that's like 5 teaching units. So I like the idea of sermon-based small groups. We have had it in our church to some degree, and I thought it was very helpful. And we actually created every week, small group lessons, study questions, digging deeper. I would create a whole kind of a devotional based on the sermon. Let's not, think about it, if you add personal devotions into that.
Right.
Okay, so if I'm reading the Bible, say I read the Bible 5 times this week, I heard a sermon, heard a podcast. So again, some people aren't reading anything, so you say, well, I got to throw it all at them.
Sure.
No. But if I could give you a devotional based on the sermon, a small group based on the sermon, then I could either get deeper or get more specific to what
Yeah,
I
like
need.
the Soper commentary.
Right.
At least everybody's on the same page. Have you found it helpful after you have preached to rewatch the sermon? Or after you know what you just preached? Do you find it like you?
Oh, yeah.
I could tell you what my main point is now, right after the fact.
Yeah. I listen to my sermon every time I give it. We videotape them. Typically, when I'm on the treadmill, I'm like, all right, here we go, because it's painful. I hate watching myself. And honestly, when I watch myself, this is the thought I have. Why would anyone want to listen to that? And I'm being serious.
Oh, no, I agree.
It
Same in my
humbles
head.
you. It humbles you.
it's brutal. I look at it and go, I can't believe people come to church to hear
Oh, yeah.
me.
Yeah.
And then I get up next week and I'm always like, man, just thanks for coming. I can't. Be grateful, man. I don't expect, I don't know why in our culture today, there's Netflix. You don't have to come listen to me. It's a nice day outside. Why are you?
Yeah.
So I would try to respect that by preparing well and doing well because you know what? But I think sometimes I'll watch my message right before I'm going to preach. Sunday morning or so. I'll watch
Because you had a Saturday night service.
Right, but not that service, the week before.
Oh, okay.
And I'll pick up things because I'll videotape and I'll watch. And sometimes I'm like, man, I can't. And my memory was getting so bad, man. Sometimes I was like, what am I going to say next? I don't even remember what I was going to say. But you're right. I think it's brutal watching yourself preach. But it's critical because you pick up pacing and things you do, and it wasn't
Was I
helpful.
clear? Did the big
Yeah.
idea surface?
Right. And,
Did I
and,
hammer it
and
home?
again, I think it's critical for other people to give you feedback too. After the message, not just before. Hey, give me some information, but what did you think? What was And I have a whole family full of kids, and it was great to have my teenagers say to me, I said, "Did you get that? Did you understand that?" My 14-year-old, hey, was that? Did it make sense?
Right.
I used to preach with really high RPMs. I would almost yell the entire sermon, and then I sent it to you, and you were like, "You have got to calm down, like your RPMs." And I changed it, and I think I've gotten a lot better at
you're
that.
great
I
at it.
never would have changed that if you didn't give me that feedback, because you just, you're out there and you're like, I gotta yell because I gotta get everybody's attention, and if I yell, they'll listen better. Well, that's not true, but I thought it was true. And then when you pointed that out, that really helped me a lot.
That's important because I tell our guys this all the time. Take what others say at the door when they greet you on their way out with a grain of salt. Because they're going to blow smoke up your butt. They're going to, good job, Pastor. That was a wonderful message. They'll never give you that feedback.
No,
They probably won't say, stop screaming
No,
at
you
us."
have to. No,
You got to have a coach.
You got to have people who actually publicly speak for a living. I mean, my wife's pretty honest. I mean, she's pretty good about being honest.
Sure.
And my kids are pretty honest. But you're right. You need to have people who professionally speak, because here's what happens when you have somebody who does it for a living or does it all the time is they can then actually tell you how to improve it. I don't know. I didn't like the message. What do you like about it? I don't know. That's what you get for people who are professional speakers go,
Sure. That's
Or-
good.
But on the flip side, if a professional speaker says, I had a guy who's a professor of rhetoric, come into my church, not a Christian guy. Now he became a pastor, which is crazy. But he was a non-Christian. I said, come to my church and critique. Give me feedback. I want to know you actually do rhetoric it's your major, your doctorate.
Sure.
So to get those kind of feedback from professionals.
So feedback's important.
Critical.
I always encourage people to get the feedback before you preach it, though. I mean, unless you're a traveling pastor like yourself. The one
You
day
know,
message.
No. But here's the thing: the feedback afterwards, it helps you the next time you're gonna.
It's
for
critical.
delivery,
It's
and for
critical.
delivery, and even for writing. Like you sit there and go, no, wait, I agree both.
I'm going to make that point. Go ahead.
But I think both is good. But I think afterwards, because you threw it all out there, and then you meant, okay, something I missed. Next time I go, I got to do that
Yeah.
differently.
Yeah, next time you go. So, yes, feedback afterwards is critically important. I would encourage, if you're not doing it, to pre-record at least your audio and listen to yourself. If you can pre-record the video, which in our context, we have to do some weeks because if another campus doesn't have an early service, I got to give them something. And so I'll preach to an empty room, on a Thursday afternoon or something like that, and I'll be able to listen to it. I'll be able to watch it. And I'll be able to really step out of the stress of presenting it and just sit back in my chair, drinking a cup of coffee with attentive ears to say, what am I going to get out of this? And sometimes it's like, it ain't there. It ain't there. But I'd rather, if I'm only going to be able to preach this once, rather be able to get that feedback that's critical to understanding what my big idea is.
Yeah.
Here's one more thing, and I'll let you comment on that. The one thing that we do, and if you have a website, you might want to consider doing this because a lot of people don't have time to listen to a 35-minute sermon. And one of the statistics that's proven, if you look on YouTube or Vimeo, there's a way to, if you put your sermons online, no matter how you do it, if you host it, there's a way to find out, have people finished your video? So I love how people say, well, hey, we had like 300 plays, 300 people watched that sermon. That's not true. How many people finished that video? And there's a way to actually find out if they've finished watching the video, not if they watched 30 seconds of it or your first sermon, the first 12 minutes of it, but did they finish it? And that was really eye-opening to us. And so what we started to do was put mini, highlight recaptures of the big idea, just pull out the big idea of the sermon. And it's usually between 3 or 4 minutes. It's one of the main things that I look for. Did I use a prop? That's usually what I'm going to include, when I talk about the prop. Was it a powerful illustration that highlighted what the text was? Did people cry? Were people really engaged at that part of the sermon? And so before going into the sermon, I write a C next to a spot that I think that's it. I think that's really going to connect. And it helps me really focus on memorizing that part because it's going to be vitally important. And afterwards, it's really eye-opening to me. If that's the part that we pull and put online, then that's telling me about what the big idea was. And if I can't find that, if that's not there, because I'm doing it beforehand, it's a red flag to say, you got nothing to say here. Or this other stuff wasn't that valuable. If at the end of the day, 24 hours after the sermon, or when we post it online, if that's the only thing that they were going to remember, then it's just a little bit, it's interesting. It's very, it's just very insightful to have that piece of information.
I think one of the things about preaching is, both meter, timbre, there's all these other things, but one of them you're talking about is almost kind of like also there's an energy pattern within a sermon.
Yeah.
And what you're looking for is the high energy patterns. Where's that place that really and what Charles used to say to me when I was preaching there, he'd say, you really started preaching at this point. And that would mean just the energy level got ramped up. And that was really when you started, people were, whether it was humor and then you kick them in the gut. I always make them laugh and then, make joke of somebody. Isn't that like us with God, right in the stomach, And that's a good, but again, that's where those moments, and if I don't have anything like that,
Yeah.
then there's some problem.
Then apologize the next Sunday for.
Right, how crappy your sermon was.
I like that. Any other thoughts on that?
Nope.
2 questions. How long do you prepare a typical sermon? How long do you take to study and write it?
15 hours.
So how much out of that 15 hours is study? How much of it is writing? How much of it is practicing? Typically.
I'd say 3 hours is practicing. 5 hours to 7 hours would be research, and then the rest would be writing it.
So about 5 hours to write a sermon, 7 hours to study it, 3 hours to practice it.
About that, yeah.
Now, that's not even taken in is that taking consideration your 4 weeks of prep beforehand? To plan a series is much different than to write a sermon. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's a lot of brainstorming that goes on before that, right?
Yeah, that would not include
Okay.
the brainstorming for the whole series.
Phone drop. That's good. What about when you were in the daily grind?
I really don't know. I think different week to week it was different. And here's the problem I have is early in ministry it took me longer. And the longer you're in ministry, the longer you saturate yourself
Yes.
in the Word. I gotta be honest with you. If you preach the Bible and other evangelists, I just know so many books of the Bible, and you can pull stuff up, you can remember stuff. So I think the longer you go, it gets easier. So I would say, early on, probably 20, 15, 10.
Do you think there's an unhealthy on either side?
I think it's such a sermon prep to me is a very personal thing that it really is hard. I think effectiveness is a key thing, but yeah, I definitely think you could spend too much time in the study. I mean, I heard a guy tell me that he spent 20 hours in textual study alone before he even started getting into the thing, and this guy had a bunch of kids, and I'm like, you don't do anything else then.
Right.
And I think that's way overemphasizing the value of a sermon.
Sure.
And I think if you're spending more than 20 hours a week, I think that's ridiculous.
More than 20?
I think more than 20, unless you are the preaching pastor of a church that talks to thousands. Now, I got to be honest, because I'm a people person, I had to lock myself in and say, look, this is loving my congregation by making sure that this is
Sure.
a quality thing. That if these people are going to spend their time to listen to me, I got to make sure it's good, and I got to put that. And so, loving that person who's crying outside my office, they can talk to somebody other than me. But
Because you have other leaders.
I have other
and-
people, or no, because we train up, wait up.
Yeah.
It doesn't always have to be me, and I had a big family, and I had stuff going on, and I can't always do everything. But part of the way I love my congregation is preparing well. But I think it gets overboard, and you're going to neglect other things, and you won't have contact with people to bring you the information you need for the message.
There's 2 seasons. One, as a young pastor, it'll take you longer. As you get more experience in ministry, it'll take you shorter. You'll be more efficient. And 2, the other season is, as your church is smaller, they'll depend on you for more pastoral care. As you grow larger and you develop staff, leaders, elders, you develop those leaders, you won't have to spend as much time doing that. They probably will rely on you, right? More for teaching?
I think the bigger your church gets, the more work you have. I hate to say it that way. It sounds like I'm prejudiced. But
Do you have?
I went to
the
from
bigger
a
your
church of
church, though-
200, from a church 200 to a church of 700, and I'll tell you, I have more time to be taken away from writing sermons at 700 than I did at 200.
Okay.
Because I just think there's more, because you got staff concerns, you got bigger projects, more people, more stuff. I think we got to be careful that we idealize a large church. And the pastor of the big church, all they can do is just sit in their room and study and love Scripture and speak it beautifully. I think it's hogwash.
There's
the
other
more responsibility, the bigger the church, the more. And then they expect you to be everything and the guy who gets up and gives that perfect sermon. Okay. So I think it's really, the larger you get, the more discipline you have to get about saying, look, I've got to set aside a certain amount of time because I just don't want to produce junk on Sunday.
Sure.
And when do you think best too? Like if you're in the morning, make
I'm
sure
a
you
morning
block out the morning and then do your meetings in the afternoon or vice versa.
Yeah.
You know, I tend to, if my energy is low, I try to meet with people. If it's high, I'm trying to do sermon prep because it takes me more concentration to do sermon prep than meet with people.
I'm morning. Like I
Same
said, I love getting to church early. I'm a morning person. I function best in the morning. As soon as 1 o'clock comes, I'm just shot. So if I'm doing my major sermon prep, so I think knowing your own body, knowing your own rhythms of where your mind is tightest. But then shooting the whole weekend. See, my days off are always Monday, but shooting the whole weekend doing sermon prep like Friday, Saturday, you're eating up all your family time.
Sure.
That's not good. You should be. I want to have that thing wrapped up, practiced. I always get up and I can't believe guys don't practice their sermons. Like I got up and I would go through it, maybe go through it again if it didn't work.
To an empty
To
sanctuary.
an empty sanctuary, and I would get up there and preach it because I want to figure out how it's working through.
Yep.
And then how my because I use a lot of slides, how that all works together.
Yeah, so when someone says 15 hours or whatever their preparation time is, a big chunk of that is still just has nothing to do with researching, writing, studying. It's practicing too.
I guess a question I would ask people, and maybe this is somebody can come tell me, the advantage to really deep research. Because what I think we tell people is we are the holy priests who understand the Bible. You could never understand it. I'm being serious. I want to know, are we teaching the priests and the believers when we say, man, you better know how to get so deep into this thing?
Yeah. The worst thing you can do, the worst thing, is to say, your English Bible says this, but the Greek says this, and so this is what it really means. Because what you're telling the people is,
I'll never know
don't
what
read
it
your
means.
English Bibles because it doesn't.
I'll never know what it means.
Or to me, when you come up with such esoteric, complicated, deep, mysterious things that they don't, I didn't know, I could never get, then they just give up. I honestly believe if I just read that passage, the truth of it should just, and I should then say, what did you do, Pastor? Oh, Pastor, no, I just read the passage. And guess what? You can do that too.
You can do it too, right?
And I want you to interact with the Bible because the Bible, it's right there.
That's what I love about what we're doing as far as going through the Bible is that you're developing self-feeders. There's nothing complicated about it. You're teaching people how to read the Bible.
But I think we want to spend all this time researching, and so I feel, again, the security and identity. My identity is I am the one who's plumbing the depths of the Scripture, bringing it to, as I meet with God like Moses, and I'm like, dude, you're a human being. I'm a human being. The Holy Spirit's coming in us. Work at it, do it well, but then, again, don't make it so, that's why I think just keep reading that passage, it'll come out. So the Bible speaks.
Sure. Last question before we wrap up. Can you recommend any resources, leadership trainings, books about preaching that might be helpful?
I think the book Biblical Preaching is excellent. I'm gonna not come up with names.
Okay.
But the guy Biblical Preaching is the guy out of
Hayden Robinson.
That's
a good book.
one of Effective Communication, or I'm sorry, I can't come up with names. But Preaching by Keller's a good read. I think that's interesting. I don't agree with everything in there. They eat the chicken.
That's the name of the book too. Preaching by Tim Keller.
I thought that was excellent. Good. There's a book, Effective Communication. I watch a lot of people. I learn from people. I'm in Toastmasters right now. That helps me with communication. That's a great resource. Secular,
Right.
Podcasts about preaching. There's great. What's the name of that? The videos you see online, the teaching videos. Simon Sinek did his.
TED Talks.
TED Talks on preaching are phenomenal. But again, I think all those things just continue.
TED Talks on preaching, or
Yes.
just watching TED Talks?
TED Talks on speaking.
On
Public
speaking. There's
TED Talk-
actually a TED Talks book.
Right.
That's really good too, and there's so much to glean from how it's 18 minutes.
But
They say so much in 18
watching
minutes.
a good preacher also, I'm not mimicking, but learning like, hey man, this is a technique. There's some great communicators out there. And thinking about, to me, one of the key risks is thinking about things like diction, like clarity of thought, like things that you don't usually think about, volume,
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
speed, conversational tone,
By listening and watching other people.
and yourself.
You want to put a little, before we ask Dave, as far as resources, you want to give a little plug for what you're doing?
The district's going to be doing, we're going to be doing, Sally Fry and I are going to be doing a communication intensive. And so we're going to be in, it's not been really publicized out there, but it's going to be out there. We're going to do the first one in Cortland, and then we're probably going to be doing another one out here in the western part of the state. But we're going to be looking at doing these once a month, communication 2 hours intensives to help work on these skills.
Cool. Very cool. Get involved in that.
I would say be a student, don't be a critic. We all have our favorite preachers, but listen to them all. Listen to Andy Stanley, Craig Rochelle, Stephen Furtick, Bill Hybels, Tim Keller, John Piper. Listen to some local guys because all of them have something to teach us, and just learn.
And you're not saying get your entire theology.
No, I'm not. I'm
from
talking
any
about
of them.
just pure communication style. What makes Joel Osteen so effective? That's a great topic of discussion. I mean, like it or not, he's the most popular preacher in America. There's a reason he's effective, and you don't have to agree with his theology, but there's something there that people are drawn to.
Great speeches, great orator speeches. I mean,
Yeah.
great, Winston Churchill, people there's certain truths about communication that transcend just that are human. God designed us, the Creator designed us, hardwired us, and some secular people have tapped into that. So I would even say secular speakers.
Yeah.
Any other resources?
Craig Groeschel Leadership Podcast has some good things on communication. You can Google any of this. Andy Stanley has good stuff on preaching.
He's got a book too.
He's got a book called Communicating for a Change.
Yep.
Dynamic communication, that was the name of the book I was thinking of. That's a really good, because that talks a lot about things we never think about. We don't think about as pastors.
Remember the
Lighting.
author?
It's the guy who's a comedian, Christian comedian.
Ken Davis.
Ken Davis's book, Dynamic Communication. That is a really good read.
Cool. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you guys joining us, sharing your experience and your gifts, and hopefully you've been benefiting from it. So thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.